Hello, everyone, and welcome to another topic worthy of discussion. Today, we're going to do land counts part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, I definitely suggest you watch that first. It can be found in my topics worthy of discussion playlist on YouTube. In part 1, we tested 3 different decks to try and establish an ideal amount of land in each case. We came in somewhere between 15 and 18 land for each of the 3 decks. Unfortunately, though, it's not that simple. There's definitely some other considerations that need to be made based on the cards in your deck, and I'll run through some of those here. For you newer players out there, it's going to take some practice before you're able to weigh all of these different factors and arrive at a correct decision. If you're unsure of where to start, I'm hoping this video will provide some insight and give you an example of how you can approach this problem. The first consideration we'll talk about is hand smoothing. Hand smoothing happens in best of one draft formats on arenas such as Premier Draft or Quick Draft. In these games, the arena program actually deals you 2 opening hands instead of just 1. Then the program chooses one of these 2 hands to give you as your opening hand. This all happens behind the scenes, and many players aren't even aware it happens. The program does this because it wants to reduce the amount of times you're dealt a terrible opening hand with an unusual amount of land. So the program draws 2 random hands, then leans toward giving you the hand with an amount of land closest to the average amount for your deck. For example, suppose you're playing 17 land with 40 cards total. This means you would have 42.5% land in your deck, or 17 divided by 40. For each game you play, the program is going to deal you 2 random opening hands it can choose from. Suppose that our first hand has 2 lands in it. If your hand has 2 lands in it, that's 28.5% land, or 2 divided by 7. Now suppose the program deals you a second hand with 3 land in it, or 42.8% land. Because the value for the second hand is closer to our overall average of 42.5%, the system is more likely to give you the second hand as your opening hand. However, this is where it gets tricky. No one seems to know exactly how smoothing is applied. The game creators have said the game leans toward, quote unquote, one of the 2 hands, but exactly how this is done is unknown. The way I did it, each of the 2 opening hands is assigned a probability, and this probability influences which hand is picked. But who knows if this is how it's actually done. Secondly, there's some evidence, emphasis on some, that Arena does more than just smooth your opening hands. It may actually smooth the cards you draw to more evenly space out the land. I'm not sure if this actually happens and didn't build it into our model. What we do know for sure though is that opening hand smoothing does occur, and it makes it more likely you'll draw an average amount of land in your opening hand. So what does smoothing do to our results? Let's look at all 3 curves again, but this time we'll apply smoothing. The first thing to note is that with all 3 curves, smoothing drastically cuts the amount of times you will mulligan. As long as we're playing 15 or more land, our mulligan rate is consistently between 21 and 24%. Smoothing reduces our mulligan rate by about 10% on average. So with every curve, smoothing drastically reduces our mulligan rate, which is the whole point of smoothing. However, according to our model, smoothing also affects the amount of land we want to play, which is an unintended consequence of smoothing, I'm sure. With our normal curve deck, the blue line is our values without smoothing, and our orange line is how our values are affected when smoothing is applied. With this curve, smoothing makes the difference between going to 16 land instead of 17. Smoothing makes it more likely we'll have enough land to operate with 16 land, because we're more likely to have a reasonable amount in our opening hand. So if we're playing a best of one format and are on the fence about cutting an additional land, smoothing could be the factor that pushes us over the edge. With our low curve deck, smoothing also favors cutting land, but it doesn't affect our decision much in this case. We're still basically indifferent about going to 14 land, so I'd stick with 15 in this case for the reasons I described in part 1. As you can see with our high curve deck, smoothing also makes a difference. With this particular deck, smoothing changes our decision from running 18 land down to 17. So smoothing is definitely an important factor to consider and is something that should influence your decision if you're playing in a best of one format and aren't quite sure on the amount of land to play. Now let's quickly run through some other considerations that can affect how much land you should play. No two decks are exactly the same, and the cards you play are going to influence your land count. I think the mana curve is still the most important factor, but there's definitely other considerations. Also, note that even if one or more of these considerations are met, that may not be enough to justify changing your land count. In other words, it's probably going to take more than one card to decide if you want to cut or add some land. These factors need to be considered in the aggregate and should influence your decision, but not dictate it. The first consideration is smoothing, which as we just saw favors cutting land from your deck. Next is if you have mana producing cards in your deck. If you have cards that can either search up land or produce mana themselves, this favors cutting land from your deck. For example, the Renegade map is an artifact that can be sacrificed to search up a land from your deck. The Druid of the Cowl is a creature that can be directly tapped for mana. Playing cheap spells like this that can add to your mana favors cutting land from your deck. Having card draw in your deck also favors cutting land, again providing those spells are relatively cheap. For example, Divination is a 3-mana spell that lets you draw 2 cards. The more cards you draw early, the faster you will find the land you need to operate, and the less land you can afford to play. Longer games also favor cutting land. As a game goes longer, it becomes less likely you need to draw some land, because you're already going to have what you need. You would almost always prefer spells late game, so longer games favor cutting land in place of spells. For those wondering, each game we played in our simulations was 10 turns long, which I'm hoping is pretty close to the average amount of turns in each game, but I had no data to support this either way. Now let's look at some factors that don't favor cutting land. The first is playing 2 or more colors. To keep things as simple as possible, all of the decks we tested were single colored decks. However, if you're playing 2 colors, which is usually where you want to be, cutting land may make it less likely you draw land of each color. That would also lead you to regret cutting land. I guess one way you could test this is to ask, if I'm playing 2 colors, for each land count, what is the likelihood I'll end up with 1 mana of each color in my opening hand? Assuming we divide our mana up as equally as possible between each color, we get this table. As you can see, the likelihood of drawing 1 land of each color falls as we cut land. But it doesn't drop off a cliff or anything like that. The difference between 17 land and 16 land is only 1%, which works out to about 1 in every 100 games where we would see any difference. So I would say it's still an important factor to consider, but not as significant as you might think. Also, playing cards with abilities that cost mana does not favor cutting land from your deck, providing those costs are important and you would like to use them if possible. For example, the Whirler Maker costs 3 mana to cast, but then 4 mana every time you activate it, which is quite a bit. You would only play this card if you plan on using the ability, so we'll presume it's important. It's also expensive, which does not favor cutting land. Weaponize the Monsters is another card that is useless without its activated ability, so it doesn't favor cutting land from your deck. Cards with abilities that allow you to loot also don't favor cutting land from your deck. Looting refers to discarding cards in order to draw cards. For example, the Facet Reader has an ability that lets you draw a card in exchange for discarding a card. In theory, this could let you discard extra land you don't need in favor of spells. So maybe some excess land is a good idea to ensure you get up to what you need quickly, then you can just pitch everything else you don't need. So looting does not favor cutting land. However, you could argue the opposite is true as well, and use the facet reader to pitch spells in favor of land if you don't draw enough land early. If that's true, then maybe the facet reader does favor cutting land for spells. It's an interesting argument. My experience is that if I'm in that position early, where I'm forced to pitch spells to find land, that's a dangerous place to be. Also, the ability isn't free and requires mana plus tapping the creature, which could be a good way to get yourself killed quickly in the early game. So I guess you could go either way, but if I had to pick one, I'd say looting in general favors not cutting land. Next we have multi-spelling, which does not favor cutting land either. By multi-spelling, I mean casting multiple spells on the same turn. Remember with our model, the criteria for cutting land was that we would regret it if it slowed us casting other spells in our hand, but we didn't pay much attention as to whether it prevented us from doing multiple things on the same turn. Some games are won or lost precisely because you did or did not have enough mana to do two or more things on the same turn. I'm definitely not going to sit here and say that multi-spelling has no value. At the same time, I view it as more of a consolation prize for drawing too much land. It's a really nice bonus, but I'd prefer to draw just enough land to have access to every spell I draw than just pound my opponent endlessly with spells. I feel like I'm winning those games more often than not. All that being said, if you're looking to combo your opponent or unload your hand quickly, multi-spelling is an important consideration and would favor not cutting land. It could be another reason why your aggro deck should stick with 15 land instead of going to 14, but it's hard to put an exact value on it. Going first also doesn't favor cutting land from your deck. If you go first, you'll draw one less card than if you went second. This means you have less cards to work with and are less likely to find the land you need. With our model, we went first half the time and second half the time, and then averaged those amounts. And finally, if you're going to insert more expensive spells for land, that's probably a bad idea and doesn't favor cutting it. With our model, we inserted a 2-mana spell for each land we cut. The assumption was that in the range we were testing, we would almost always have the mana to cast these cheap spells. Therefore, we would prefer the cheap spells over the land, providing this didn't negatively impact the rest of our deck. However, if we inserted 4-mana spells instead, we would have gotten the same results, because we were only testing the impact on other cards in our deck. Just be aware that cutting land for expensive spells is probably not the greatest idea. Okay, that's it for part 2. So to conclude, we found that you usually want to be between 15 and 18 land for your deck. 17 land, the default, is usually right in the middle of where you want to be. So I still think it's a great starting point. And if you aren't sure where to go from there, I would just go with that. The main consideration for how much land to play is going to be your curve. If you have sort of a normal mid-range kind of curve, 17 land might be the right amount. If your curve looks lower than that, consider cutting land. If your curve looks higher than that, consider adding land. Once you get more comfortable, start considering some of the other factors. Unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rule for these, and experience will help you weigh them and adjust your land count accordingly. Okay, thanks for watching another topic worthy of discussion.